Welcome, everyone. This is a pretty awesome and exciting moment, I think, for all of us on stage and many of us in this room, because this is the panel that kicks off for us the Competency-Based Education channel here at ASU+GSV. And I feel very fortunate to be on this stage with some OG CBE. That means original, by the way. Some OG CBE pioneers and folks who have really been living that work. And so we're going to have the opportunity to hear from both Paul LeBlanc, president of Southern New Hampshire University and author of Students First, and also Charla Long, who leads the Competency-Based Education Network today. So thank you both for making the time and joining the fun up here. I would just like to kind of get a pulse of kind of who's in the room here to make sure that my questions aren't like, totally boring for everyone. So talk to me, can we just do a show of hands? How many folks in the room are more higher ed focused folks? Higher ed? And how about folks in like K-12 mastery based? Oh, wow. And then tech in some capacity that supports in some way. All right, little crossover there. Awesome. So about 50-50.
And who's here for Tom Vandar? Because he's actually across the hall. You're in the wrong room. We look a little bit alike, but he's better looking. Right? Yeah.
So, of course, here to talk about competency-based education. And when we talk about this, I think the thing that excites me and probably most of us who have been doing this work is it truly is about expanding access and expanding pathways and expanding equity and making learning more transparent for all learners, whether we're talking about those of you in the room who are from the K-12 spectrum or for those of us who bring more of a higher ed lens. And so I do just want to kick off and ask first, and Paul, I'll start with you. When we think about competency-based education, what it is, what it isn't, we'd love to hear your perspective of what it is.
Yeah, I think it's often, let me put in the affirmative. It's an architecture. It's a way of structuring the underlying sort of questions and drivers of our educational models. It really, for me, often comes down to two questions that on the surface seem pretty straightforward. What claims are you making for what students can do with what they've learned? And how do you know? The assessment question. Those seem fairly simple. Once you start unpacking them, they're incredibly complicated. But here's what they don't do. They don't force you to choose a pedagogical approach. They don't force you to choose a way of structuring your term or your academic year. They don't remove academic freedom. There's all of these misconceptions that we run into again and again. And I think in my favorite model, which is direct assessment, they also untether us from the clock hour, which I think is deeply inequitable when we tie people who don't have a lot of time or control over their time to structures of time, being in class on a certain day at a certain time.
Yeah, absolutely. And so I know we recently had done a study at Guild where it was close to 70% of our working adults had said that they needed flexibility, right, to be able to actually pursue their degree, to be able to actually make a better life for themselves. And so I think CBE truly does enable us to provide that kind of flexibility. Charla, I know over the years we've seen articles come out or folks say, CBE, like not high quality, or even faculty sometimes will say things like, oh, it's lesser than, it's a race to the bottom, it's skills-based, it's not for us. As you think about some of the misconceptions and things that happen in this space, I would love to hear from you, why does that happen and what kind of quality things do you see in the field that help us kind of get away from that narrative?
Yeah, great question. CBE can be done poorly. If you don't watch it, you don't do it well, you don't follow some guardrails that should be in place, just the same way traditional education can be done really poorly. And so I would say quality is really a central tenet to what we do in competency-based education. Lisa, you asked, and I know you said what tools. We have a quality framework for competency-based education programs. If you've not seen it, it was field created. When I look around this room, I look at people in this very space who helped to create that document because we wanted to make sure if people were going to slap a competency-based or a mastery-based learning label on something, that they were actually doing it well. And so I think if you haven't taken a look at that, you might take a look at the quality framework for CBE programs. I think a lot of times people say negative things because they don't actually know. And they may have heard something, they may have read something, but if you really dig into what CBE does, it's focused on outcomes. What is it? You said claims. What are those claims we're making? How am I going to know when a learner is there? What's the assessment I use? You say they're a critical thinker. Where'd you teach critical thinking? Doesn't happen just because they sat in your class. Had to be taught somewhere. Where did you assess it? So all of that goes back to a very rigorous system that should be in place to actually teach it, develop it, assess it, remediate it if they don't get there. All that's the kind of quality that we look for. Really allows us to shift to that outcomes-based focus.
You think, Carla, Charla, that...
Call me Carla.
I like Carla, too.
Peter, I don't really mind.
We've only known each other 18 years now. I'll get it straight. No, Charla, I think one of to your point, when we think about traditional curriculum, we often think about what am I teaching? And then, what is the content?
What's the textbook
I'm going to use? And then
use?
what is the textbook?
Yep.
And then, what are my modules or my sequencing? What will I do for outcomes? And then how will I assess?
Yep.
Right? And
CB,
we reverse it. We start with what do we want the outcomes to be? What do we want them to be able to do? What should they know? And then now let's work backwards from that. It's a really very different way of approaching curriculum.
When I was a faculty member, I lost my side mirror on my car because I was trying to write an assessment on the way to school, which I needed to administer as soon as I arrived. And so I'm literally writing while I'm driving, which is not good, but I hit a mailbox and I lost my side mirror. And then it was just a constant reminder, like assessment's an afterthought. And in CBE, it isn't. It is the thing that we do before we ever start to build the journey, those learning experiences. I'm thinking about how am I going to assess it? How am I going to know for sure they meet these outcomes?
And I think when we think about quality and this focus on assessment, I think there's just this misconception, right? That it's like, here's a competency, here's an assessment, have at it, learner, right? And that is not the case. Can you talk just a little bit about some of those kind of interstitial parts that happen in a high-quality programs that you run, perhaps, Paul, at SNU? What kind of supports do you see that are more holistic in that learning journey and a competency-based approach?
So I think I just had lunch with a group of students who will be on the panel after this one. So I spent some time asking them.
Plug for that panel.
Oh, sorry, the panel after the one after this. Lori Dodge, the original OCB person, is here from UMass Online, the school formerly known as Brandon. But talking to these students, they talked about the real-world authentic assessments that they used every day in the sense of its relevancy. And they said something that I rarely hear in traditional classes, which is my projects, I didn't call them assessment, my projects felt like the learning. In other words, it's not the sort of judgmental stance of so much assessment, but it's assessment in a really formative and constructive way. And then they talked about the ability to test that learning the very next day at work. They all work, they're all working adults, these three students. So I think those parts are really critical. And then that ability, in our model, the ability to go back and have a not yet, so that when they struggled and they get something back from the instructor, it wasn't you get a C and now slide on to your next project. It's like, nope, not yet, which is a growth mindset.
Absolutely.
Right? And then you keep doing it and you resubmit. And they were funny about it. They said, so you don't have to come to the panel later now. Yeah, they said that, it's a 72-hour break before you can resubmit, and they would sort of set their watch and then hit the finger poised over the send button because they were so eager to get it back in the hands of their evaluator to see how they did. It's really, what a motivating, right? It's a really very different way to talk about the work.
If I could add to that, the opposite side of that, for those of us that are faculty and have served in faculty roles, what happens when it's not quite yet? And do we really know what curricular experiences we would put in place to help them get to mastery, right? We don't give up on them. We keep coming up with another tool, another activity, another teaching, another reading, so that I can get them to that place in which they're at mastery, right? That's what I think is one of the really unique features of competency-based education. If you're not quite there, it's okay. I'm gonna be with you. We're gonna get you there. Here, have you looked at this? How about if we sit and practice this? Can we role play this? Can we do this? Right, until we get them to mastery. That's a growth mindset for us too, right, as faculty, because we're often like, I stand up and teach it. They either got it, teach and hope, or is it teach and know, right? I know with no doubt my learners left me having got what I expected.
One of the students said at lunch, now at work, if I have to write a long document, a 15-page paper, shrug, like, who hasn't done that? And I was like, really? Because a lot of college students don't write very many 15-page papers, as the research tells us.
Right.
But again, that sort of sense of accomplishment and owning their learning, they talk a lot about owning their learning.
What that does for them from a confidence standpoint, right?
It's huge. It's huge. As we talk about learners, talk to me a little bit about when we think about competency-based education. We have folks in the room from K-12, from higher ed. What type of learner or type of student is CBE best suited for?
Anybody that needs to master content.
Tell me more.
Let's be honest, right? Don't we go to school because we're trying to learn something so that we can get to the next thing, whatever that next thing is? I have a junior in high school, I hope he never listens to this, who we withdrew from high school last week because high school doesn't work for him. They don't care if he can master it or not. He needed something different than what we have for traditional education, but we can't offer that. So if we want to be really candid, it works for the learners who need to master content. And I can't think of a single learner that doesn't need that, right? Or we shouldn't be doing education. So that would be my comment.
And we do have a lot of learners, however, they've come to be in this place that don't want to do that level of hard work. It's not for people who want to slide by, because there is no sliding by. And I think one of the things we don't talk about enough is that if we were truly committed to competency-based education, we would actually see graduation rates drop for a while. It's harder. It's harder to design well. It's harder to deliver. And I think we should embrace that, right? I don't want people sliding by. I don't want my pilots to be good at everything but landing. It turns out landing's really hard. Right? It's an important part. I don't want my surgeon to be good at everything but closing. Hello, this is right? So we want people to be able to master across what we say is important. And I think this is one of the reasons employers love CBE.
That's right.
It gives us a kind of lingua franca. Now we're talking about the same thing. They think about skills and competencies all the time. What can my people do? What can't they do? I've done this a million times. It's a party trick at this point. Talk to a bunch of CEOs or HR directors and ask, have you hired anybody from a really reputable four-year school that doesn't write well? You know how many hands go up? Every hand goes up. And you can do that with skill area after skill area, which is why they don't trust us in the way they once did. College degree was a powerful signal that you could do things, that you knew things. It's not that strong a signal anymore.
Wouldn't it be great, I'm so sorry, from the K-12 standpoint too, I look around at our K-12 friends, your whole mastery-based transcription work, how empowering is that for a learner to come with, these are the things I know and I can do, this is where I want to go, and for the higher ed folks to be able to take that and help grow those learners to the next level, really working with a more asset-based approach, that I think is one of the greatest benefits for the learners, and why I say any learner could benefit.
Yeah, if we could unpack another benefit that we haven't touched on yet, we know that we did some research at Guild where I think 76% of our working adults work over 40 hours a week. Many of them are first-gen learners. Many of them are caretakers, whether they're parents or taking care of elderly parents. And so there's this element in competency-based education where you can slow down when you need to. You can speed up when you can. And I would just love to hear kind of a first-hand story. I think, Paul, you have a couple where you've really been able to see that impact firsthand. Can you tell us a little bit about a learner who's really benefited from that kind of flexibility that CBE can provide?
Yeah, the book I did that came out last fall called Students First that you alluded to.
ISBN number.
I did not put her up to that. But the first chapter opens with a student that I met at a partner of ours, Duet in Boston, who uses our CBE program. And when I met her, she, at the time, had a 7-year-old daughter with chronic respiratory illness. She came from the poorest neighborhood in Boston, from the Roxbury neighborhood of Boston. And she had gone to the two local community colleges, Roxbury Community College and Bunker Hill Community College. Her transcripts were littered with W's and F's. And I asked her about this, and she said, every time a little girl gets sick, I miss a week of class. And I fall behind, and I can't catch up. And if it's early enough, I take the W. If it's too late, I take the F. And of course, she's bringing down her lifetime Pell every time she does that. And when we put her in a non-time-based program, she flourished. She raced to completion. She had her associate's degree in record time. She was really smart. And now she's working on her bachelor's degree. And she had a great line. She said, you know, I'm the calendar. Right? I set the calendar. She set the pause button, no penalty. In fact, the students I keep alluding to, they were talking about that today at lunch, how important that was to them, because all three of them come from very low-income families and all support their families in some ways. They all work far too many hours that we would ideally choose for them. But they can flex. They can dial up, they can dial down. They all talked about that ability to do that and how important that was. So I think that's really the critical piece. And the revelation for me in writing that book was, I kind of knew this, you all know this instinctively, but the extent to which time is a function of privilege. All of us who have privilege, we have more time and we control our time. If you don't have a washer and dryer in your apartment, it just takes longer to have clean clothes. Something I don't even think about. I do that on the way to grab a sandwich, you know, throw a load of laundry in. If you don't have a car in much of the country, it takes longer to just have food in your refrigerator. And on and on and on. And if you work in retail, if you work in fast food, if you work in any number of industries, you probably don't know your schedule 2 weeks from now. So to ask you to enroll in a program that asks you to be at a place and at a time is really hard, which is one of the reasons our online programs have grown so much, or just our traditional online. Why? It's asynchronous. At least I can control my time better. I can be a student when it works for me.
Could I just add that when she stops for her 2 weeks because her kid is sick, if it's a well-designed CBE program, and I don't care if it's K-12, higher ed, we would be making a phone call, right? What's going on? I noticed you haven't signed in. Oh, you're having struggles with your daughter? Let's talk about it. What do you need? How can we help, right? And so CBE really is about being intentional to connect what happens in student services and the non-academic side of the house with what you're seeing in the academic side of the house. How do we work together? We're running them off like flies. Oh well. I hope it was okay for you. But anyway, I feel bad when people leave. It makes me feel awful. I'm like, did I offend you?
She's just trying to pressure the rest of you.
I'm trying if I keep going. But it is about both sides of the house, the non-academic and the academic, working together to help support that learner. You think about some of our houses that our K-12 students live in. My husband's a principal of a school that uses mastery-based approaches. When you think about the environments children live in, what am I doing? How can I help support those learners? You know, maybe that kid that's not coming to school over and over and over again is because mom's having problems with transportation, or maybe we need to think about things differently. So that's I think, a unique element of CBE as well.
So when we think about the flexibility and pacing, the human outreach, the human touch that's needed, we've often heard people say, well, because of that, it must be more equitable. We must have more access here. And I'm curious, because the title here is On the Edge of Mass Adoption, right? Like, what data, what outcomes data have you seen that really helps prove the case that we have more equitable outcomes or better outcomes to date?
So an important one that we, I think, don't talk enough about is the inequity in our transfer credit system. It's not really a system. But for example, if on the national level, the graduate of a 2-year college in America loses 43% of his or her credits when they transfer to a 4-year school. Who goes to community colleges? Think about the demographic. You're building in, you're structuring in inequities. It takes longer to graduate. It's going to charge you more. It's going to take more work for you to graduate. So when you move to a competency-based model, what I really like about this is, again, it's an architecture, right? So it's not about arguing what kind of content. It's an architecture. And if we can have an agreed-upon national framework of competencies, then I don't have to make judgments about whether I should take these credits or those competencies. We now have an exchange rate, if I can use the metaphor of currency, and I can make sense of what you've learned and give you credit for what you've learned. It's very powerful, and I think it makes the system efficient, and it takes some of those inequities out of the process.
First of all, I'd love to say we don't have enough data. If I was being really candid, we have institutional data. Like, I can tell you what's happening at Northern Arizona, and I can tell you the results of Sinclair. I can tell you what's happening at Texas A&M Commerce. I can tell you about the results of single institutions that post their information. But we need the national data that allows us to extract that out. And so it's something our organization is trying to give a lot of thought to. How do we one, fund something that's that comprehensive, or how do we just report on it and segment out this learner population so that we could do that? I think we could sit here and listen to tons of amazing results at SNU, or at many of our members that are in this room have those same kinds of stories, but we do need the national data for that. And then secondly, I do think you can build a program that doesn't achieve equitable outcomes. And it is something that happens only with intentionality, that you really design your program with equity in mind. We did a recent collaboratory, it's kind of our research lab called the Collaboratory, and it was all on equity, and institutions from around the country joined in to say, how do I do this more equitably? But it's hard work, and for many of them, if I was really candid, didn't really want to do the hard work. They wanted to give lip service to equity, but not really make the kinds of changes that they needed to do. And so I think that's the same with traditional models as CBE models. Do you really mean it, and do you really want to do what's needed?
Yeah, can I give you an example where we got it wrong?
No, let's do it.
You know, these are conferences where you always pretend you get everything right, so I'm going to give you one where we got it wrong. We're sort of working on our third iteration of CBE, but on our second iteration of CBE, there was some sort of critiques about sort of rigor, et cetera, and we actually let a different team do the second version of the program, and they overcorrected. And that overcorrection then had inequitable impact. So plain language design. Now we're going back in CB 3.0 and taking a look at language and how we use language in that. So there are a number of things you can do, and they were all well-intended, but we didn't have that sort of equity mindset, fully like, what will this mean? Yeah.
I love that. I love that. Switching gears a bit, I think all of us have heard about the war for talent, not a buzzword that anyone hasn't thought about. And we see more and more employers talking about skills-based hiring, and maybe we don't need the degree, we can just go with skills. As you think about CBE, how can it help address, the war for talent while creating kind of a world where we can have skills but also still have access to a degree? What does that look like for you? Charla, you want to start?
I'm going first. Okay. Well, first of all, I think it's because we use degrees as a proxy for what a person knows and can do. And so when we start to talk about what it is a person knows and can do, which is really what skills-based hiring is, we connect in more powerful ways with people who are hiring our graduates if we're on a higher ed side, and certainly with institutions that might be receiving them from a K-12 into a higher ed setting. This is what this learner knows and can do. I look at Jennifer Graby here on the front row with the nursing accrediting body, and they've moved to competency-based nursing standards. Why? Because I don't want just somebody who has a nursing degree. I need to know that they actually have these particular competencies, right? And so in the same way in workforce, they want to know for sure you've got these particular skills. Not that you have the degree. I'd love for the degree to be there, but I need to know with assurance that you have these skills. And so I think that's why we see some of that skills-based hiring, because they didn't think they could rely on our attestation that you've got a bachelor's and you really deserved it. You mastered everything.
And a traditional transcript is sort of a black box. If you take managerial accounting, I might infer what you can do with that, but I don't know for sure, and I don't have reassurance about what you've actually mastered in that process and how I can put you to work today. And even in the places where we have the most rigorous assessment, and nursing came up as an example, and we're working with a very large healthcare system, which still says, look, as rigorous as assessment is, and by and large, we do rigorous assessment where our lives matter. Medicine, pilots, et cetera, right? But even in that case, all of their new nurses do another 6 weeks of their own internal training academy before they'll let them loose on their own with patients. So I think our transcripts are not enough, and that's an important part. But the other part I would say, Lisa, is that the old 4 and 40 model, 4 years of university, 40 years of career someplace, we know that's hopelessly gone. And we know that the half-life of skills now is increasingly shortened. So 3 to 5 years is a number you hear quite often. So even if you don't change your job will change out from under you. So a competency-based framework allows us to build micro-credentials, shorter base time learning that allows you to dip in and out of a learning ecosystem, But again, you have to have some sort of understanding framework, architecture and framework for how to understand and structure all of those micro-credentials that ideally stack and lead to degrees. We have to be careful because I think degrees remain important, but it doesn't have to happen all at once. And for a lot of people, the privilege of 2 or even 4 years is just not available. That's too much of a deferred payoff. And from an employer perspective, if I were channeling Byron Auguste, for example, he would say that we use the degree as a proxy that builds in, again, another kind of inequity when we attach it to jobs that don't really require a college degree. So let's talk about the skills that are actually required and see if we can allow people to demonstrate that they have those skills.
That's right. And so we see a lot of movement in the space where people are trying to come up with like a common skills currency that every university can use, and all of these employers are magically going to also use that common currency, and then we would be able to create this skills ecosystem. As we see like kind of nascent and growing movement in that space, what are some of the opportunities or challenges that you see with that kind of thinking or with that kind of approach?
You want to go first this time?
Go right ahead.
So, the Common Core was a real success, as you know. No, teasing. So if you try to, in an ideal world, we would have a national skills framework, and it would be constantly updated with real data, and we would sort of do this in a rational way. We're not going to do that. If any time, we're moving the other direction. And then I think internally for traditional institutions, that notion that we would have our curriculum dictated to us by any kind of other authority besides the faculty is going to be just a governance firestorm. So I think both of those things are powerful impediments to trying to do. Now, what I do think is that increasingly employers will be the accreditors of choice in some ways. Traditional accreditation is not going away, but increasingly when you have employers putting their hands up and saying, I'll take a Grow with Google certification, and I will use that in my hiring as a basis for hiring, you now have a different kind of validation of quality that looks different and isn't relying on accreditors to say this is good. So I say my friend Stieg Larsson here, who's been thinking a lot about how do we move to outcomes-based forms of accreditation. I think that is the future. Part of what's getting in our way with CB is that neither financial aid nor accreditation has kept up with what we're doing, what we're inventing collectively.
And Paul would really love to talk to you about chapter 5 of his book about what we need to do.
Chapters. This is impressive.
I know. I know it backwards and forward. Look, that's pretty good, isn't it?
Part with all the sex and violence in it, which is why she keeps reading it.
Meow. So, federal financial aid is a challenge, right? And just the way we structure all of the things that we do, right? Our K through 12 system, you are where you are at this point in time, and then you move to the next level, and then you are where you are, and you can just keep adding to the fall behind nature, or maybe the child's really smart and they want to get ahead and they want to skip a grade, and we don't, all those kinds of things. We just use time as the anchor instead of learning. And I think until we can shift that, all these kinds of challenges that we're facing, aren't going to be addressed.
Yeah, let me just give one example on this. We're mapping with our partners at the Da Vinci schools in Los Angeles. We've been mapping the competencies to the California high school graduation frameworks. And in a perfect world, we would allow students to demonstrate mastery in a way that earns them progress towards their high school degree and an associate's degree or even more at the very same time. Here's the problem. There's limited Pell or federal financial aid for high school, right? We need a dual enrollment financial aid system. And because we base on time, as Charla says, we're not there yet. And the problem right now is that I think the current administration is so consumer protection minded that innovation and the kinds of things we're talking about are just a dirty word. During the Obama administration, kind of had both. You had a real sort of narrative around innovation, even as you had a kind of consumer protection mindset. Now it's all consumer protection. So this is hard going right now.
As we think about some of the challenges that we've encountered as we've tried to grow and scale competency-based approaches, we have some tech folks in the room, I'm sure from different places. What kind of opportunities do you see for technology, for tech companies to help us grow and scale CBE in this space? Paul, do you want to start?
Sure. Well, just as a policy, good. Almost always, policy follows practice. So we have to put the practices in to know so good policy can follow that. In many ways, systems follow practice as well. So right now, because our federal financial aid system doesn't support very well CBE, nor do the financial aid systems that are built for that. They tend to be course-based, et cetera, et cetera. LMSs tend, by and large, are built to emulate the classroom and are sort of teacher-centric, course-based centric. Both they and SISs don't really support very well the ideas of competencies, micro-credentials, things that aren't degrees and programs, et cetera, et cetera. So there's a lot of work to be done in that space. Phil's here. Phil, am we getting this right? I'm just putting Phil on the spot.
I think interoperability is another big issue. You know, most schools have like cobbled together something that's working. And there's a ton of manual process in there because those systems aren't talking to each other. So from an ed tech folks' standpoint, we love your products. We want them to be interoperable. We want them to talk to each other because it makes our job easier. And when our job can do that, I can personalize learning better. I can give learners real-time data. I mean, we're struggling with that. I think we had, sorry, I saw you move, but ed tech folks who joined the movement early and didn't maybe stay with us all the way through. And I would encourage you to come back. The number of new institutions in this space is incredible. We do our annual conference every year. This past year, nearly 70% of schools were brand new. That much growth. And so I think when there were a few of us, 7, 15, then 30, it was hard for you to make that kind of an ed tech investment. Now, there's a lot more demand for it, and schools are struggling to keep all those kind of technologies talking to each other and really, really working the way we want them to.
And in their defense, I mean, the system's built to serve what we asked them to serve, but now we're asking for something different. But it's a massive investment. Yeah. So we're asking a lot from them. But I do think we're kind of going through the Gartner curve, right? So when CB felt at its height, we were irrationally exuberant and thought it would change the world overnight. It's sort of like the MOOCs. And then we went into the slough of despair where everyone said, see, this was really another bad idea or a fad. But really what I see now is, as you say, it's just coming up everywhere. It's just sort of quietly growing in a way that I think is a little bit under the radar screen. But you look up one day, as we have with MOOCs, and all of a sudden Coursera's a major player in the higher ed landscape. edX just got sold for $850 million. Like, these are big enterprises. They look different than what we originally thought, but they're...
Look at this room. When I'm just going to be candid. When I walked into this room at 12:30, I thought, oh my lands, there will be no one in it. We have 12 people standing around the back, and most of the seats are full. That says something, right? And so, welcome. We're all glad y'all are here, and if we can do something to help you, I'd want to. They keep telling us to stop.
I'm
getting nervous.
I do want to open it up just for a couple. No. Oh, we don't have time for questions. Okay, no problem, no problem. Then I will just ask one last question for those of us in the room here. For those who are here who are more interested in dipping their toe in the water and learning a little bit more about CBE or getting started in CBE, what advice or insights would you have for them? So Charla, we'll start with
I'll do it real fast. Start thinking about your outcomes. What are the claims you make? Using your line, what are the claims you make? And thinking about performance-based assessment. Can you see them do it? Have they actually done it, or have they told you how they would do it? Did they really do it?
Buy my book? No, sorry.
ISBN number.
I mean, it is a good first step.
No, a much better investment. Go to CBIN. Go to the annual conference that Charla's team hosts. It's the place where you get immersed. You're in a community of like-minded people. You'll have so much expertise to draw upon, and all kinds of very practical workshops and ways to get you launched.
And there's a little flyer right there, and little pins that say "Got Competency." So if you want to be one of the cool 500 with one, feel free to grab one on stage. Thank you all.
I will just say, for those of you who are here in the room, I am happy to kind of stick around, mill around. I think we have a few minutes, but just we couldn't do audience Q&A, so that was part of, I think, why we were nixed on audience Q&A, which is all fine and good. But if anyone has any questions or wants to further explore, please come chat with any of us throughout the conference. But also, I do just want to acknowledge that this is an entire channel that started with this panel. I believe we were the first. And so please feel free to stick through that channel and learn more about CBE throughout the time here. So appreciate both of you. I have to say we had an inside joke that whoever could work meow into the panel was a winner, and that was Charla, who did work meow into the panel. So that was quite impressive.
It's really good, and y'all laughed, so I worked it in well. So I'm very excited.
So Paul, Charla, thank you so much for your time, and for all of you who joined, thank you so much.
Thank you all.